Okay, this is going to be the first video in a series, kind of an introductory series to AutoCAD, specifically Civil 3D, but this should apply to any base AutoCAD program. And to just cover the full series, will cover basic drafting and design, all the different tools, just methods for that. But this video is just a brief introduction to the actual program to give you an idea of the general concept of what we're doing here and just kind of orient you to what you're going to be seeing, what you're looking at. So this is AutoCAD, specifically Civil 3D in its 2024 version. Um, but pretty much when you open AutoCAD, you're just looking at a blank space. Um, it it's in black color, but think of this as just a piece of paper. This is our paper, and we're essentially living in a 2D world. Um, so we can go up and down, we can go left and right. Um, Now, obviously, as the name would suggest, Civil 3D, it has the capabilities for 3D work, 3D drawings. Um, but the base way any drafting is going to be based in 2D, and then we can represent it or make it in 3D in more complicated versions. But as far as basic drafting, we're looking at 2D. Um, so just to quick orient you, you'll probably notice, especially throughout these videos, I move whatever this thing is in the middle around a lot. This is your crosshairs, um, and this is kind of to help orient you and guide you. Essentially, this is your mouse pointer in AutoCAD, if you think of it that way. And you have these crosshairs. Now, we'll discuss this more in a minute. I There is a personal preference of how you set this up, but essentially where the little box is in the middle is your kind of click point, and then the crosshairs are essentially to guide you around. Um, so as I mentioned, this is a 2D space. So if you kind of just look around, um, you'll note this first thing down here. This is XY. So this, if you remember from any map making, any graphs in math, XY, so your X direction is horizontal, just left and right. Your Y direction is vertical, just up and down. Again, in the 2D world, we don't have a Z direction, but in 3D, that will come into play. And that's pretty much it. So this is kind of a blank slate. Um, so you'll also note up here, there's kind of a coordinate system, or a compass, but it really only it's truly relevant when we have a coordinate system built in, which we don't, and for basic drafting we don't need. That will be relevant once we have an actual design and we're designing something that is in the real world that has a real physical location. Um, so just for reference, we're looking here. What we're looking at is the model space. If you come down to these tabs on the bottom, you see we're clicked on model. So this is where you're drawing. This is where you do all your design, all your physical drawing. The rest of these tabs, which these are preloaded based on our specific settings, but those are layout tabs, and essentially that's for printing. That's for once you want to produce your plan sheets or any kind of printing object, that's where we stick those. So as far as basic drawing, this is the world you're going to live in model space. To further orient you to some things, just so you're more familiar with the layout. So down here, again, this another thing it will tell you model, and so it says model or paper space. So the layout views, this is what we call paper space because this is going to be the printed paper. So it's almost like a print preview in that sense. There's a bunch of little buttons down here. These are mostly just for just random tools you can use or modes you can switch on and off, and we'll go through all of these. You have your drawing scales and different things. And then a big thing, which we're not going to dwell on here, but there's a command line. So there are multiple ways you can do things in AutoCAD. So essentially what you're going to be doing is using different tools. So if you note up here, all these different options are different tools, drawing tools. So think of it, you know, like a pen or a pencil or a compass or, a ruler, all these different things you can do. Okay, well, there's multiple ways to get to these tools. You can click a button, you can go from a drop down menu, or you can manually type it in a command line. In the old days, and not that I'm that old, but I still was taught this way and prefer this way. Um, as much as you can, especially the basic commands, um, there's just keyboard shortcuts to type them in, and we'll work through all of those. And so you can just type them in the command line, or you just start typing, and it'll pop up that tool. Um, but again, all of them are in a toolbar somewhere. So there used to be smaller toolbars like this, and you would dock them all over your screen, and it was kind of a mess a little bit, and you had to kind of pick and choose which ones you wanted. Now AutoCAD has kind of this more Windows, Microsoft style ribbons at the top. So you have all these different ribbons, and there are collections of different tools. So don't be put off. There is a lot here. A lot of these you may never use. But the Home tab, this is kind of where the bulk of the things you're going to need are, both for Civil 3D design, but also basic drafting. For basic drafting, essentially right in here, your draw and your modify areas of the Home tab are pretty much all the basic tools you'll need to do any 2D drawing. Okay, and we'll get into each of these, at least all the relevant ones, throughout this video series. But that's where they all are. But I just wanted to kind of brief you a bit more on this kind of 2D world we're living in. If you're unfamiliar, if you've looked at a lot of specs or plan sheets, you kind of get how to see the world from a 2D perspective, but a lot of people that's kind of hard. I know nowadays we're used to looking at like Google Maps or our GPS, and we get to see that aerial view of the world, and so our minds are a little bit more accustomed to seeing kind of things in plan view, or looking from above. But I had drawn this earlier, and bear with me, it's obviously a terrible representation, very simplistic, but if you think about a basic table, and if we want to visualize that in 2 dimensions, right? So say we were measuring, so we can measure in 3 dimensions, but on this piece of paper, or if you had to draw out the measurements yourself, you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to sketch out a little 3D looking table. So you would say, okay, from the top of the table, right, it's got a length and a width. And if we look straight and I can measure that side, I can measure this side. Okay, but from the top, or the aerial view, or what we call the plan view, this is what a table looks like, just basically a rectangle. So now we can think about, well, what other ways should we look at it? Now let's look at it from the side, and that way we can measure the height here. We can still get the length out of that, but now we've got the legs on here, and there's a depth to the actual top of the table. But this is what we call, it's the side view or the profile view. Now on a 3D object like this, you've got a third profile view or a second profile view, say from the front here. So this is going to be what you look at from the front of the table. But you've already got essentially all the dimensions you need. So for the most part, we're just going to be working in a plan view and one profile view. And essentially that will give you all the information you need on any object. And so in our 2D world, this is essentially what we're looking at and how we're going to have to see the world. That you're going to have to, as a designer, as a drafter, be able to understand that if you're just given this view and this view, you just need to understand what that makes and how that translates into a 3D realistic world. And that's sometimes the hardest part. But that's so that's the basic overview, at least of drafting and kind of looking at the program. I did want to provide one more option. I mentioned these crosshairs and how big they are. So there's one way if you just type options here, and now we have kind of, these are the main options for the program. And there's quite a lot in here that you'll never need to mess with. But we can change things. I mentioned the square in the middle of the crosshairs was your pick box. You can change the size of that. And that's all personal preferences. Change the size of the actual aperture in the middle. We can customize when we right click what that means, and we'll talk more about that later. But as for now, basically, it's up to you. You can actually change the background from dark to light. Normally, I prefer having the dark background. That's kind of the standard AutoCAD. Some people prefer the white. Personally, I look at computers long enough all day long. I try to minimize the brightness as much as possible, so keeping the dark background. Plus, a lot of the colors, when we start color coding lines and different things, it really doesn't show up very well, or maybe I'm fairly colorblind, so it's kind of really hard to see things like yellows and greens and light blue on a white background, whereas on a black background it's definitely a lot easier to see. So I personally keep it like that. But again, here's this crosshair size, and it's set at 100. That means it goes the full length. You can knock that down pretty far. Let's just say apply, and now you can see it's more of a specific thing. So again, this is kind of your mouse pointer button, and we'll talk more about selecting and things. When you hover over things, they'll light up, and this is kind of how you draw. So the middle of that is essentially your mouse pointer. That's completely a personal preference. I always just prefer the full crosshairs, just for various reasons. But then, me personally, the crosshair won't get lost in the drawing, essentially, because I'll always kind of have those guides to see where it is, and it can give you kind of rough estimates of things like how close these lines are, or different things like that. But that's 100% personal preference, and that's something you can set yourself and kind of adjust as you move along. That being said, that's kind of the basic overview. We still have basic things like opening new projects, saving, similar to any Windows. But otherwise, that's it for this video. The rest of the series will start looking into all the different tools, and how we use them to start our drafting process. So, thanks.